This setup is actually quite cute for Portuguese public because it reminds us of some kind of a live sitcom we had, which is called Conversa de Treta, which can be translated to crappy talk, maybe, but that's not what's gonna happen, I hope.
Okay, well, now I'm filled with
this is a good start. So probably something you don't know about Phil Elliott is that he actually began his career as a video games or a technology journalist at BBC. And then suddenly, like most, and an increasing number of people around the world, he crossed to the dark side of the force and is now in the game development area. So Phil, do you want to start by talking what makes a video games critic or journalist to cross the area and go to game development? Because you're not the first one and you're not the last one, of course.
Do you know, it's even worse than what you say, because it's not so much development, it's even worse, it's publishing. So it's genuinely terrible. It really is the dark side.
That's like a lot of the Sith of the game development.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll do my Darth Vader impression, but so I think for a lot of people, the reason they get into games media, frankly, is because ultimately they love games so much. Okay, I think this is one of the most exciting and terrifying things about actually being in the process of making games, is that our fan base, gamers, are so passionate. They have so much enthusiasm, and they invest so much time, energy, and ultimately money into their hobby. And we have to deal with that, whether it's good or bad. So for me, I actually, the first job I took out of university was in radio. And that had nothing to do with my degree at all. I did an English degree because I had no idea what I wanted to do for a job. So I figured, instead of doing a science, which would kind of narrow it down, I'd do a humanity and an arts subject and keep it nice and broad. So it was a bit of a no decision, if you like. And I only got involved in radio because it was the student radio station on campus. And so in the end, my degree at that point had nothing to do with how I started jobs. So, if you're ever worried that you don't know what to do, that's exactly the position I was in. I really kind of wish, actually, I'd done computer science, because then I'd be making games now instead of, I guess, funding and publishing them. But, and so I actually joined the BBC anyway as a station sound producer, an audio producer for one of the radio networks, the news network called Radio 5 Live. And so it was only when I was there that I kind of fell into journalism almost by mistake, from a casual conversation with the controller, where I was very upset because the network wanted better ratings from 25 to 34-year-olds, and the network's coverage of consumer technology and video games issues was horrendous. It was really, really bad. I think if I hadn't got frustrated, then I certainly wouldn't be sitting here, and I don't know if I'd be working in video games. And for me, I kind of look back on that point as a big turning point, and it taught me something, and that is, whatever you're doing, care. The more you care about something. A lot of the content that was going out on this radio network had no interest to me. Politics, business, health, stories, news, blah, blah, blah. But I still cared deeply about whether or not we were going to do well in our achievements. So when there was something that I could tell was bad, it made me frustrated, and ultimately I got to do something about it. So I didn't really get into media intentionally. I didn't think what I really want to do ultimately is be a video games journalist. And I mean, no disrespect to people that do want to do that. I think it's a fantastic career. But for me, it was really a passion to want to represent the stuff I knew about and I cared about better. And then I went into specialist. I joined GameSpot and then gamesindustry.biz, because I actually just wanted to get close to games. Now for me, the ultimate, and to finally answer your question, all of that was because I think most people who get into writing about games at some point really want to be getting into making games. They have opinions about games, they know what they like, and to be able to kind of touch that process and be part of that process, and actually make something or help make something, is ultimately what drives a lot of people. So I'm not surprised we see a lot of crossover from people that write about games to people that work around games.
We had a previous interview a few weeks ago, and something curious about when Phil described me the idea behind Square Enix Collective. I felt there was some kind of a sentimental or artistical responsibility from your label towards the actual indie market. Do you want to tell us a bit more? Because you always told me, you actually told me you wanted to give back in some way, not in I told you, not in ingenuity way. Of course, this is a business, but from the business to be able to let the market grow by itself and give back a bit.
Yeah, so I think if you look at video games, yes, it's a business, it's an industry. As an industry, we churn out content all the time. We're probably churning out more content now than we ever have because of the sheer number of games. Okay. So it's easy to forget that at the core of what we do is creativity. If we stop being a creative industry, if we stop representing cultural expressions, if we stop providing, as an industry, ways for diversity of experience, of expression, of emotion, if we don't provide the pathways for all that to come in, then eventually we lose our spark. I think AAA is very, very important for the industry, and it's easy for me to say that coming from Square Enix. You know, most of our games are obviously AAA games. They are there to make money. Okay, they're big games. They have to make money, or they have to earn revenue, because we put millions and millions of dollars into making these games. So we have to earn enough back, and the ambition is to earn more so that we can then reinvest back in to games. That's what we do. That's what publishers do. So we're not ashamed of making money. Most publishers are listed corporations and probably pay dividends to shareholders. But in the end, for it to be a sustainable business, we have to make enough money to cover the costs and to reinvest. And the way that we express that is through big games. However, if you expect $30, $40, $50 million plus investments to risk on new ideas, genuinely new ideas, new emotions and experiences and perspectives, that is probably a recipe for a company to go out of business quite quickly. Who's familiar with Papers, Please? Who's familiar with Dear Esther? You like those games? Interesting? Why? What makes them interesting? Different. Right, exactly. When I first played Papers, Please, I played it quite late at night. I don't know, this isn't normal for me, but I just had a block of cheese. And I played Papers, Please for about 2 or 3 hours. And then I went to bed, and I had the most terrifying dreams. But it's because I was in such a haze of feeling this oppression, this futility of decision, and this emotion which a game had a particular emotional response that no game had given me before, and it affected me deeply. So much so that I then had terrifying dreams. I mean, it's not like it changed my life, but it was a definite touch point, a touchstone for how I played a game about something I'd never played a game about before, and it reminded me, if anything, of something like without wishing to sound pretentious, but something like Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, which if you read that, there's this real kind of, you feel almost feverish with this sort of oppression and suspicion and you're almost fatigued by it. And I thought, well, that's amazing. When I played Dear Esther, whether you respect it as being a game or a walking simulator or whatever, I consider it an interactive experience, and I consider it a game. That's just my view. But after that, it only lasts a couple of hours, and I finished the game, and it fades to black, and I sat there for 10 or 15 minutes just kind of pondering what I'd just played. Now, as I mentioned, I did an English degree, so, in my formative years, used to thinking about things like literature and plays and poetry, interpreting, trying to understand what they're about. And I had this experience after Dear Esther where, for the first time in probably 10 years, I wanted to interpret and reason about this game I'd played or experienced. And my wife walked past, and we went to the same university and actually both did English. And so we used to discuss literature and poetry and stuff together. Now, since we left university, I don't think we've done it once.
You can listen to Bob Dylan now.
We can listen to Bob Dylan, yeah. That's a contentious issue, isn't it? But she was intrigued. Now, she doesn't play games. I think she gets a little nervous about controls and things like that, which for a non-gamer is completely understandable. But because Dear Esther, as a quotes walking simulator, if that's how you want to label it, it's not a frightening game or experience to approach. So the following weekend, she played through the game, and when she finished, we sat for about 2 or 3 hours and just discussed our interpretations of what we'd seen. Now, Papers, Please, Dear Esther, and I would say probably a corporation conspiracy in EVE Online, I would probably now list as 3 of my favourite, most fulfilling and interesting and memorable after the event experiences in games. That's not to say that I don't absolutely love Football Manager and World of Warcraft and Call of Duty and Destiny. I love and absorb all of those games and put far too many hours into them. But I firmly believe that meaning comes from difference. If all we have is AAA, then ultimately all we're going to get is, give or take a little, experiences which are by and large the same, particularly in terms of emotion. We're great at adrenaline and action. We're great at racing. We're great at adventure. But what about all the rest? In science, I don't know if you're familiar with spectral analysis, which is where they take the frequencies of light from stars and then they use that to understand which elements are in those stars. And the way that it visualizes is like a grey strip, and then you get these little lines of a very bright light. So, maybe a line of red there and a line of green there or something like that. Google it, look at the image, you'll see what I mean. But for me, that represents a little bit about what video games is in terms of emotional diversity today. Okay, we have some really, really bright lines, and those look really cool and they really stand out. But the rest is grey, and that's the rest of the emotional spectrum. And when you look at literature and when you look at film and TV, as cultural influences, they do a great job of filling in the rest of that spectrum. That, for me, when I see something like a Papers, Please, excites me. I would even go so far as to say Life is Strange. It's one of ours, so I'm not objective, but it's trying to tackle different emotions, different situations. And I find that so exciting, because I really believe that one day we will be on par with film and TV, and we will be accepted for being a genuine art form. But I don't think we should rely on AAA for that to happen. That creativity, that diversity, that exploration is almost certainly going to come from the indie space. So when we as Square Enix think about the future, we look at platforms, what consoles are going to be dominant versus the PC landscape. We look at genres. We look at business models, episodic, free-to-play. We try to think ahead in 5 years to figure out what the opportunities are, because if we're going to invest tens of millions of dollars into something, we want to try to react and give something that people are going to be excited about when that game releases, and usually it's 3+ years. But what people don't talk about is the health of the industry. what's the health of the industry going to be in 5 years, in 10 years? For us, that relies a lot on exactly what I'm saying. Creativity, new experiences, difference. That's where the meaning is. And we believe that if the industry is increasingly diverse, increasingly meaningful, and increasingly representative, then that will help the industry to continue to grow. And so for us, it's a simple case of the high tide raises all the boats. We want to keep growing as a business, therefore we want the industry to keep growing. So Collective is trying to, as I said earlier, help independent businesses become sustainable. We're not trying to fix an entire industry's issue. We're not trying to be the only solution, but we want to do a little bit to try to see a future where creativity is protected and encouraged. And my own personal passion is that I can't wait to play all the games I haven't yet played or experienced. So for me, I'm very lucky because that's where my job satisfaction comes from. But that's health. And it's an intangible. People don't talk about it enough, in my view.
You were talking about emotions, and we can do, from a production kind of view, a parallel between the cinema and the video games industry. Do you believe with the growth and the more mature way of watching the video game industry, you can get to a time where indie developers and authors and people who are experiments can gain a broader attention? Like, for example, we had Iñárritu winning an Oscar, and his movies stand out from the big blockbusters. So that's how we stand as a media with almost 100 years old, like cinema. Video games are growing faster because of technology. Do you believe one day that artistic and experiment can go and push to the broader audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it already is happening. I think if you look at a range of video games awards around the world, in the UK we have the BAFTAs and we have the BAFTA Games Awards, and they do reward artistic merit as well as commercial success. I think you could point to, obviously a lot's happened in the last few months for better or worse, but No Man's Sky, certainly started out its journey at E3 a couple of years ago as an indie game, and although Sony published the kind of the boxed version of the game, they self-published on PC and digitally. That's an indie game which captured the attention of millions and millions. I mean, it was the game of E3 when it was announced. It came from nowhere. I look at that and that is incredibly exciting. Unfortunately, I think as an industry we have a tough time when it comes to expectation. I'm not going to weigh in on that particular game. I mean, I know Sean personally, and I think it's a very hard situation to deal with, but it's also a very hard situation for gamers to face. But I think it shows that if there's something genuinely new, and I think there can be so many things that are genuinely new. I think at the moment people are just used to mainly hearing about AAA. I think that's going to change. Personally, my belief is that the budgets of sort of 1 million euros to maybe 2.5 or 3 million could grow to become one of the most significant elements of the industry. And I think who's heard of Life is Strange? Okay. I mean, that would fall into, I think, broadly that category. And honestly, I don't know what the game budget was for development, but so don't quote me, please. But it's
not being recorded.
So it's going to be around that kind of scale, right? And that was something which did capture the imagination of a lot of people, and we have a very, very dedicated community for that game, which is fantastic to see. I think in this instance it probably rewards Square Enix for taking on that game. And I think we're very proud. We didn't know about this at the time, but as we were going through the process of doing the marketing and the PR and so on for the first episode of Life is Strange, for those that don't know, it has a female protagonist, and it's well, in fact, I'd say several of the main characters are female, and for us that seemed perfectly natural. But it was only after we signed the game, we were actually doing the PR, that the developers told us that we were the only publisher that didn't ask if they could change it to a male lead. Now, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry when I heard that. But I'm just really glad that people can look at that and maybe learn a lesson, you know?
You're talking about the difference between AAAs and indies and even AAs that are coming smaller in the market. In terms of production budgets, I remember 3 years ago I was speaking to Colin Johansson from Guild Wars 2, and they were nominated with Guild Wars 2 aside with FTL, and he was saying, like, we have this budget that I can't remember how many people developing the game. And he went to FTL's booth, which were two guys, I don't know if literally or not, developing the game on their garage. And they are, in terms of recognition and nominations for awards, at the same level as a game with the size and investment as Guild Wars. Do you think this is becoming each time more frequent, and if it's a good thing?
Yes, I think it is becoming more normal for that to happen, and absolutely it's a good thing. Now, the truth is that Guild Wars will almost certainly have earned more revenue because the price point will have been higher, the marketing will have been broader, and it's also Guild Wars 2, obviously, you know, a part of an existing franchise. But the cost of development would also be huge. So, you know, if you're FTL, you probably have, and this is an assumption, but I'm sure it's in the order of maybe 1% of the dev budget of Guild Wars. So if you make 10% of the revenues, you're very, very happy. So it's all about scale. You know, I think in terms of absolute revenue generated from indie games versus AAA, it's not a contest. I mean, the point, of course, is that it should also not be a competition. I think we are maturing enough now in terms of both society and the industry to accept a much broader range. But, you know, you've got to remember that for smaller teams, absolute numbers of unit sales isn't as vital as it is for AAA. You know, for AAA, you've got such costs and there's such pressure on the system to have to recoup and then make profit. So, yeah.
You were talking about how the market is maturing. I remember a while ago when we spoke about your first job at BBC, or second job or something. You were talking, your target was between 25 and 35, which I believe would be with the growth among more or less our generation, which is a generation that grew up with gaming and watched it becoming just a thing for kids, which was didn't get much respect from parents and from the actual society, to something as with a huge spectrum like it has now. Can you feel it from the publishing point of view? Not from just when you belong to the media you have a specific target, but now you know that the consumers are far broader than they were 20 years ago.
Yeah, and I think that's an important part of our industry maturing, because, you know, that means that, first of all, the people that grew up with games are now becoming the dominant spenders, because, you know, they're of the age which tend to have the highest level of disposable cash. You know, I've seen some stuff recently which is worrying on a number of levels, but talking about the sort of people who are leaving university now, certainly in the UK, and I gather across Europe and the US as well, where they're coming out of so much debt that actually their chance of having disposable income for video games is probably lower than it's ever been. But, you know, because now we can truly, well, okay, who's played a Pokemon game of any kind, including Pokemon Go?
Sorry?
Pokemon?
Oh yeah, I haven't stopped playing.
So, I have 2 kids. They're 5 and 8, and they're utterly obsessed by Pokemon. In fact, the Pokemon company's on the phone now too.
We said Pokemon Go.
Yeah.
No, not that much.
I thought you were just seeing if there's a...
No.
Just over there.
But I'm a hardcore player of the 3DS games.
The thing is, I remember when that would be considered toys for kids.
Yeah.
Okay, when the Wii was released, it was considered toys for kids. And the truth is that, kids have grown up now. We still love that stuff. I'm not embarrassed by that. I think it's great. So, yeah, absolutely, we have a broader audience. We have a discerning audience. I've seen how... if you look at Blizzard is a great example. They have World of Warcraft, right, which when it launched, the people that really jumped into it were sort of 15 to 25s, okay? They've still got between 5 and 10 million people playing. I'm one of them, okay? And those people are like
40.
25 to 35 now, or 27 to 37, right? And we've grown up with that game. So one of their challenges is, knowing that their audience is trending older, how can they create new games to bring in younger audiences? So they create Overwatch, so they create Heroes of the Storm, so they create Hearthstone. And we have the opportunity as an industry now to think about games which are almost generational, which is awesome. We only used to think about console life cycles in that kind of context. So it means that there's so much range, and I think that I don't want to make a generalization that perhaps older gamers will respect greater diversity as well. But I think across the board there's a hunger for new experiences, and that brings opportunity.
I wasn't speaking only about this generation. I remember the extreme examples, for example, family members or relatives that didn't look as a dignifying thing to play video games, and if you have them on social networks, they're probably playing browser games, Facebook games, mobile games. It's that way how the video games industry conquered the hearts of it and the attention of those people that didn't believe this was a valid thing.
Yeah, I think that's always easier over time. If you look at music, I remember my parents always complaining about the music I listened to because they couldn't understand what people were saying and they couldn't hear the words. And I didn't understand that viewpoint.
So you're a metalhead.
No, Huey Lewis and the News or something back in those days. No, I don't know. Bon Jovi? Goodness knows.
So extreme.
Very hardcore. It was embarrassing. But now it's like if I think about what what my sort of children respond to, they're still young, so I can influence them more, but not to Bon Jovi, don't worry. They're going to enjoy things differently to me. There are already genres of games that I don't quite get on with, and although I always try something because I want to understand what it is that people are experiencing and why they're drawn to it. I have my preferences, and they're probably getting old school now. So I think it's natural. I think it just happens. It's almost like there are strands, like a seam of taste, which and I'm sure we'll get to fashion in the end, or music again, and we'll get video game tropes being rejuvenated from 30 or 40 years ago, and it'll just be a cycle. But I don't think we've quite got to that bit yet because we're so allied currently to technology. But VR could be the longest generation platform that we see. That could be the first genuinely stable tech base, for example, where games are experiential. And so right now, if I want to try and play a game that I played when I was a kid, first of all, it'd be terrible because it'd be like a Commodore 64 game or something. But also, I'd have to really work hard to try and find a valid way to actually play that. Certainly, if I owned it back then, I couldn't play it on the same tech now, not conveniently. Don't think it had an HDMI out. The Commodore 64, I don't think had HDMI out, so I'd be lost already.
There might be an adapter or something.
But I think I mean, again, I mentioned World of Warcraft, and there's a game that has existed on PC, and the PC has been a stable platform. I think, who knows, maybe VR will become. So you can almost have relatable experiences in the same way that you can go and watch a black and white movie now and still enjoy it for its artistic merits. I think we'll get to that point, where we will be able to go back and enjoy older games. I don't really know where I went with that answer, sorry. I kind of rambled.
Well, you were speaking about cycles. What you can perceive, especially with the indie market, it's that most of the game developers are nowadays reviving some genres they played when they were growing up. For example, the strategy games, they had their peak at the mid-90s, and they suddenly started losing interest on the market. And you can perceive that the indie developers are trying to rejuvenate these genres, not only for them, but for the people that grew up at the same time.
Yeah, and I think, again, we have this breadth of opportunity where I think you can pick any genre, and it doesn't matter if it's been done to death, that if you make a game that's good enough, that's polished enough, it doesn't have to be AAA polished, but if it's got great game mechanics and feels satisfying to play, you've got a chance. I mean, I look at Vlambeer and think Ridiculous Fishing was brilliant. I'd never played a game like that, but Nuclear Throne had some similarities to games I played when I was a kid. That doesn't diminish its quality. In fact, that game is iterated, and the design is really well polished. And ultimately, it's just damn satisfying to play. So, yeah, I mean, having got to the point where games we grew up with, I mean, going back to Kickstarter, that sort of started a few years ago and really came to prominence because people wanted to play games other than those that were being funded by publishers, right? Brilliant, because that is gamers saying, this stuff isn't enough. Okay, so that is one of the things that really started this whole movement to create these new opportunities for developers. And as soon as the Bard's Tale Kickstarter came along, I was like, finally! I've wanted to play a new Bard's Tale game for such a long time. I mean, I don't know, it's probably a game that no one's ever heard of, but it was one of the real old kind of classic dungeon crawler games. Party of 6, turn-based combat, all that kind of stuff. And I mean, I had no idea how many holidays as a kid I just lost in this particular game. So when that came to Kickstarter from the original creators, brilliant, super happy to back it. And I don't know what kind of game I'm going to get. All I know is it's not going to be the exact same game as it was, but you have to put trust in people, and if it's a great game, then hopefully it'll sell, and hopefully there'll be more. But I think you can't just recreate old stuff. You can't. If anybody goes back and actually plays old games, I remember doing it once with one of my favourites from when I was really young, called Manic Miner on the Spectrum. I don't know, I'm pretty sure no one's ever going to remember that. Okay, a few people. Okay, it's perilously hard. It's really damn hard, and I was amazed at the skill I must have had as a kid. Okay, and probably the time I had as a kid to practice. But that's the thing, you practice games. Okay, and you would. I remember playing games with my mate, and we would get so good at a game we would complete it. And what do? We didn't have any other games, so we just go back to the start and complete it again and again, and that was our entertainment. You can't get away with that mentality now. You have to make things accessible, and connected, or there's certain things which people become so accustomed to, like autosaves or things like that, where if you suddenly yank that out of something, now you might find a niche audience that really likes to punish themselves. I mean, Dark Souls, I think, probably came out of that, where people wanted a challenge, and it was almost like a point of pride to do well in that game. But that's the outlier. That's unusual. So, most people, when they go to a game, they don't want barriers. They don't want tutorials anymore. They want to be taught the game as they play.
And do you feel the developers have the fear of frustration for the consumers?
So, do you mean they worry that it's
they are accessible because they fear that if you find it frustrating to play a certain game, you will put it aside?
Because today we have so much choice. And particularly if you are an original IP, you need to make it easy for people to get into your game, I think, in the most part. If somebody spends €50 on a AAA game, they've got that investment and they probably know what to expect. But if you make it hard for someone to get into your game at a much lower level, patience is going to run out super quick. You won't get a good review on Steam, and then it's going to, impede your sales as well. Conversely, if you have something that's a lot of fun to play, I remember when I first played Gang Beasts, it looked like giant jelly babies brawling, and I watched someone playing it, and I was like, what is this game? And I was just like, what? And then I played it, and I was like, oh my God, this game is so much fun. And the feeling of playing it was very, very different. The feeling of watching it. And then I just had, maybe it was a happy accident. Maybe it was by design. I don't know. But whatever. The developers of that game understood that what they had there and then was the magic formula. So, great. I think if they'd maybe continued to develop it, and they could have lost that magic. But it was super fun to play, super accessible. If I'd just seen it, I think I would have dismissed it. But this is the challenge that a lot of games face is, in fact, how do you even get people to try your game and play it in the first place? So, that's a whole other conversation.
I'll get your cue from there, because on the last few years we watched the rise of YouTubers, and something that we could call the watch not play mentality for a younger audience, in which the sentence, I've never played it, but I watch it being played, so it's the same thing. Do you think that in a medium term that might damage the actual market? Because if you are a teenager without access to or money to spend on several games, if you watch someone playing from start to the end, you might don't get the joy to actually buy the game.
I think there is a small risk there, but actually I think it's massively outweighed by the visibility that these things can bring. And if you've got some big numbers, streamers or YouTubers creating content about your game, if it looks like they're having fun, then that's not going to be a bad thing. I've seen some people talk about, there was one particular game where it was a relatively short experience and very kind of heavily narrative based, and the game was called That Dragon Cancer. And I don't know if anybody sort of was familiar with it. Well, that's the point there. They kind of, or I don't know if it was the developers or maybe observers kind of looking on, but they made the link between very poor sales of the game and the fact that it was heavily streamed and videos created around it. And the extrapolation or the assumption was that, well, if you've got a narrative game and it's played from beginning to end, then people don't need to experience it for themselves. Actually, I think in that case, it's because the content is troubling, genuinely. I am very pleased the game has been made. I have no intention of playing it because I in the same way that now as a parent I can't watch movies about kids being abducted. I don't want to put myself through that because I think you have to be brave. So I think that argument is more about content. Generally speaking, if you get lots of visibility and awareness about a game, and if people look like they're having fun playing a game, and more importantly, if the viewer relates to the entertainer, the broadcaster, who is having fun, they're loosely called influencers for a reason, right? Because what they do and how they react to games and ultimately how they promote them, I guess, is is influential and definitely does work. So I think it's exciting because, this is an example of games adapting to technology, as we always do. But more than that, it's not just about genres of games being generational, but it's about delivery methods leading the way. And I think it's massively exciting. I mean, there was a talk on, esports. How many years have I waited to see video games be taken seriously by
football clubs,
yeah. by big players in real sports? I think that's awesome. I think it's about time.
Sign of maturity.
It is absolutely a sign of maturity. Yeah. What a time to be alive.
we were talking about a Kickstarter, and I just reminded a specific case that Kickstarter and crowdfunding worked towards a specific generation. Graphic adventures lost their momentum on the 90s, and most of the authors we all grew up idolizing and admiring their works suddenly almost turned into the shadows on the last decade. And it was with the rise of Kickstarters that Charles Cecil, with his Broken Sword 5 Kickstarter, our friends from Monkey Island with the Broken Age, just forgot his name suddenly.
Tim Schafer.
Tim Schafer, thank you. This is so terrible to forget the name of one of the people I most admire. But
I have such an amazing memory, so and my memory is so amazing. So.
Jane Jensen with Gabriel Knight. So we are watching several of our heroes, if we can tell, returning to the market through Kickstarters, because on the last decade probably big publishers stopped betting on them. It's also a good thing. We just got Master of Orion arriving, which was again with 23 years old, and suddenly with Kickstarter and indie development returned to the market. So it's also a good thing for crowdfunding, not only for new players, but old players with all the respect.
Yeah, and again, ultimately older players who probably have more disposable income. We believe that crowdfunding has become a really, really useful source of funding for developers. Not just because if you go through crowdfunding and you succeed, then you get a bunch of cash, which you don't then have to sacrifice or compromise a revenue stream or an equity share in your company. So you can maintain that independence. I'm not saying that it's not free of challenges. You maybe have a more demanding audience in some ways.
But you're not hostage to a publisher, for
example.
No,
exactly. And so, for us, when we're thinking about how do we encourage creativity, we see that as very important. Now, like everything that suffers some failures and some negative headlines, it becomes harder for the people later on. If there's a scam or a failure to deliver, this is a big challenge. So we've seen in the past 18 months or so, a smaller number of bigger campaigns raise the vast majority of funding on Kickstarter. We've also seen some of the heroes you mentioned go off in a different direction and create a new, much more closed environment with Fig, whereby I think there's an exciting opportunity for people to, purchase a piece of equity in a game, but it doesn't, their presence doesn't bring traffic to a wider community. I think with Kickstarter, when you have, big successes, you might bring new people in to maybe back something for the first time, and again, that sense that the high tide can raise all the boats, I think is a very valid one for crowdfunding sites. So it's not impossible, but it's challenging. But I would love to feel that almost as a microcosm of the games industry, that crowdfunding for video games can stabilize and mature. And I mean, I've been talking to some people, some industry organizations, about even how there's a way to expand. I mean, one of the things that we do is we try to support the trust relationship between backers and creators. If you're a backer and you see an interesting game, but you've never heard of this team before, and you do some research and they've never shipped a game, are you going to get your money? Are you going to get your game? Is what you put into it, will you ever see a return in terms of, a product at the end? Is the product going to be vaguely what you think it's going to be? It's a big risk. It's like pre-ordering, but even worse. So, for us, we try to take some of the risk out by doing the due diligence on the teams and saying, well, in our view, with the experience of shipping games and working with developers, we believe they can make what they say they want to. We can never guarantee those games because we don't take the funding, we don't ever touch the source code. We ask for a contribution of the funds they raise if they're successful. But they pay us that, not the other way around. So, we can't guarantee that stuff. But I would love to see the industry come up with a wider scheme, because we can only support maybe 7, possibly 8 games a year through crowdfunding. Because there's a lot that goes into it to try to get the best results. Imagine if there was a scheme by the IGDA or the EGDF or UKI or BAFTA or different groups that may actually be able to apply a similar principle, and actually as an industry we can start to try to de-risk the entire ecosystem of crowdfunding. I think that would be super exciting. I would love to see a sense of maturity where some of the volatility is removed, and we can almost have a sense of guarantee that a certain number of original IP games every year are going to hit their targets. I think that would be great to see. But it's remains to be seen.
Well, Kickstarter and Early Access had their novelty aspect wasted a while ago. So now,
but they're both really valuable. The concepts for them are not bad. They are very valuable to the industry. And as gamers and as game makers, it's really important for us to not let the negativity rule. We love a good scandal. We love a good scandal.
Yeah.
But it's easy for that to colour an entire section.
Yeah, but to the broader audience, I believe it's harder to counterattack some negative aspect, like, for example, what happened with Peter Molyneux, with good projects, and to regain the trust of the backers with stuff like that. How do you believe in early access when you see projects like Towns, which wasn't finished, and the developers decided to launch an early access to a sequel?
There are always individual situations which don't feel good. Mm-hmm. I think it's easy to overlook the successes. I was reading a Reddit thread yesterday talking about a new game that's just gone up on Kickstarter that I'd not heard of before, actually, and looks interesting. But that thread, there were people talking about the scams, the failures, and then there were people coming back saying, yeah, but what about Hyperlight Drifter? What about Superhot? What about all those games that were really cool and did deliver what they said they wanted to? Banner Saga,
I'm telling you, it's the added effort to not only put a good game, but also fight the illusion.
Yeah.
That's something wrong on that.
Yeah, in the end of the day, people are going to make individual decisions on whether or not they back something. And if they've had a bad situation, a bad experience, then it's perfectly natural for people not to want to do that. But again, there's lots of good stories out there and lots of successes. I would say that there's at least as many good results as there have been bad. The truth is probably that most games are just okay. There are a bunch of games that are really cool, and then there are a bunch of games that are failures. But you look at the news, and most of the time media reports on, I'm talking about mainstream news, I'm not just talking about games media. Most of the time, it's the disaster here, an earthquake there, a war here and a famine there. And the fact that somebody just donated 10 million to charity because they won it on the lottery is like a 3-second segment at the end of like 11 p.m. or something. That's just the way we are. So yeah, let's try and remember the positivity and remind each other of that sometimes.
Well, Phil will have to take his plane back to home. And I'll just leave you with the last question. You were just talking about the number of games that are released each week, and looking specifically for the greatest platform at this moment, which is Steam. which releases and gets the attention of most of the consumers. As a video games critic, I believe that at this moment, when you pay attention to indie market, it's like delving in a mud. Because there's too many things being released each week, and most of them are between okay and mediocre. Okay, we get really lots of games each week. But there's also a silver lining in this. It's when you discover that unknown pearl that nobody else found out, and you're like, these guys, this guy alone in a basement in Croatia or wherever, this guy made one of the best games of this year. And this is what the indie games market is bringing, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. But I think we should be mindful of the challenge of curation. It's amazing that it's never been, I don't want to say easier to make a video game. It's not easy to make one.
More democratic.
It's well, the challenges to actually being able to make a game have never been lower, put it that way. Okay, but the challenges to getting any visibility at all for that a game have never been higher.
Yeah.
And so whilst the future superstars of the games industry could be sitting in this room, or they could be in Kazakhstan, or they could be in Bolivia, or they could be anywhere. I nearly said the moon, but that wouldn't be possible right now. So,
But
good one, Phil.
In some years.
In the future, maybe they will come from Mars or whatever. Yeah, that's great, because it means that the net for that diversity and creativity that I talked about earlier is spread far and wide. You know, it's like virtually, probably North Korea is probably off the map right now still, but you know, pretty much everywhere else.
Yeah, you're getting games from Africa.
Right.
Cameroons.
Yeah.
It's
and
awesome.
It's amazing. It's so
you have
exciting.
to imagine the difficulties to develop a game in some countries.
Yeah, for sure. But, you know, things like Unity, platforms like Steam, you know, they make this stuff accessible to more people than ever. And of course, what happens is that more they're going to use a terrible, terrible word that no one should ever use to describe video games. More product is out there. And, you know, in the end, it does become a numbers game. So, you know, I think it's great if you do find that diamond in the rough. But I think people get used to, you know, maybe a few years ago, kind of searching and finding something was cool. Like everything else, there's a new normal now. And that new normal is probably a different way of finding games. I don't think there are so many people that will keep trying and looking. As a critic, you know, I've always felt, for me, it was a privileged position to be in, because to have access and opportunity to try lots of different games, some of them good, some of them not so good, but all the same, you know, it was a privilege to be able to have that position. But as a developer, you have to be realistic. Not many people can afford to release games and not care about sales numbers. So there is a stark reality there. And just to be clear, I don't believe that curation is an issue that Steam alone has to solve. It's not an issue alone that Microsoft or Sony or you know, EA or whoever is the shopkeeper. Yeah, of course they're part of the process, but it's a challenge for the whole industry. How do we actually be more proactive? And again, this comes down to why one of the reasons we set up Collective in the first place. Yeah, we want to build relationships. We want to find new talent to work with. But we also want to see future headliners of E3. And we want the industry to keep throwing up these diamonds. Well, that's an interesting image, isn't it? But actually, I don't believe that we can just assume that's going to happen on its own. Okay, I think we have to be diligent, and I think we have to, as an industry, you know, whether it's publishers, investors, organizations, events, awards, education, and ultimately also, you know, local government for economic reasons. You know, there's a lot of people, and of course developers and fundamentally gamers and games media. Wow, there's loads of people. You know, it's a challenge for everybody. We can't just assume that it'll be okay because it's been okay for a while. You know, we have to make sure that we find ways to to encourage new ideas and not just find, I mean, you mentioned something. You said, indie or the new AA.
Yeah.
For me, indie is exciting and a new AA is not. Just because for me it feels like AA means that it's going to become a well-trodden path.
Yeah.
And that means that although it might have commercial opportunity, which is good, creative opportunity will probably diminish.
Yeah.
So we've got to make sure the indie part of this market always has opportunity.
You're talking about curation, just to finish. You forgot to mention exactly the platform or the company. I believe they are the most strict in terms of curation on their platforms, which is Nintendo.
Yeah.
For good or for bad, they are obviously the most strict of what they released, even of third parties.
If I had a hardware platform and I had a very clear vision for what I wanted that to represent, then maybe I don't think high barriers or strong curation is a bad thing at all. I think it depends on where you want to be. I mean, I think Valve want to kind of be. I think Valve don't see themselves as decision makers in terms of what should be made and what shouldn't be made. For us with Collective, with the voting, the community building stuff, we're trying to throw more of the decision making out to the community. Would they back this through crowdfunding? That informs the decisions on whether we support that project and possibly, if the developers want to end up publishing. So there are two ends to the spectrum. I think it depends on your commercial objectives. I wouldn't criticize Nintendo for very strong curation in the same way I wouldn't criticize Steam for very light curation. As I say, I don't think either of those people are responsible for the entire industry. So, it's not just up to them to find the perfect process.
Okay. Phil, thank you for this 2 moments here. It was a pleasure, I believe, for everyone to be able to have you here in the Lisbon Game Conference.
Thank you. It's been a great honor, and I've really enjoyed being here. Thank you.
Thank you all.